they will send you an output, and you go to the next query. That's very transactional, script-based, voice bot. Conversation is like having a conversation with a human. It's two-way, and it remembers the interactions from the past, either just then or before. So there are some of the examples in the world today. These are giants. What pleases me and scares me at the same time is the pace of innovation in these companies. I was involved in the smartphone industry in 2000. I've never seen the pace of change and technological innovation that I'm seeing at the moment. It's way surpasses what's happening 5 years ago in the smartphone industry. So XAI owned X, formerly known as Twitter, Grok is one of the I think one of the foremost large language model out there today. It's probably overtaken OpenAI's ChatGPT, which is GPT-3 in 2022. And recently, if you all have been playing with GPT-5, it's moved on leaps and bounds. GPT-5 is pretty astounding in terms of capability. Meta is, of course, trying to outdo others. So they're trying to open source that others think are crown jewels. So Llama is one of the largest. I think the recent open source model is about 22 billion parameters. That's the amount of the training data set. They are being challenged all the time. Last year, or middle of 2025, I think it was, DeepSeek in China showed the world how efficient trading, efficient extraction of data can lead to same output with a much smaller language model. It's something called DeepSeek. They're also producing pretty crazy generative AI outputs. Any questions on large language models? So that's pretty foundational. Someone at the front here. The question was, using an example of one of my portfolio companies, which is private, it's called NeuroVoice, whether that's open source or not. 11 labs have a open source voice synthesis product. What we're doing at NeuroVoice is much more human-like and lower latency, replicating your voice through training data. We use a combination of public and private training in order to output both. So it's a product from a company called NeuroVoice, and we're augmenting customer service agents in call centers. It is, but all of those others are either script-based, do not use private training. Yeah, but it does not use private training. So what we're doing is to be as close as possible to human. So we're augmenting human intelligence with essentially a voice AI agent. So that's what we're doing in your voice. Any other questions before I move on? But this is pretty key to what's going on in the world at the moment. Okay. The other thing to bear in mind in terms of the speed of acceleration is large language models need a lot of resources. Data center, compute, water, air conditioning, real estate. At the moment, it's probably only 2 countries in the world that can do that. To house data centers of that is China or the United States. I don't see too many data centers anywhere else in the world. So that also raises some ethical questions about where your data is being processed and why. Okay? Maybe hold that thought for a conversation later. But there's certainly an arms race going on out there. And one of the companies that's at the forefront is a company called NVIDIA. So they arose to say 20 years ago, use of GPUs, graphical processing units, to accelerate Intel hardware for Windows machines and gaming. That's something they were doing 25 years ago. Now they're creating GPU hardware to accelerate training and inference. This statistic or this graph is from about a year ago. So in the space of just over 12 months, their revenues went up 262%. Now, their worth on the public market is 4 trillion US dollars. The size of the UK economy is 2 trillion. So one company is bigger, bigger than the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. So that kind of puts it into perspective in terms of what's going on, in terms of polarization in this new arms race. So is AI well understood? Well, probably a number of things. Half of these are in jest, but it's an umbrella term. Governments of the world and media in the world is now latching on to AI like smartphones or IoT. I'm an engineer, so I tend to not believe that stuff. Context of machine learning in 1950s. It's an umbrella term. Then once you dig deeper, then you kind of understand a little bit better about data sets and inference and training. We do use AI in our lives. I mean, you probably all use a browser to access the internet. You probably didn't know how cookies were used 25 years ago by Google or Internet Explorer or Netscape. But it remembers your behavior and serves you content based on your previous behavior. We use it in our daily lives. It's nothing new. A couple of points in jest. It is learning to cheat and deceive. Do humans do that? Probably. Probably. Who are training these data models, these data sets? So think about, I mean, I speak a lot and work with some of my engineers a lot on conditional and unconditional biases in the algorithms, right? Because that matters in terms of bias. Most AI is female. I got this, not mine, comic solutions. So I think that's just saying that Alexa, Google Assistant, Siri, all seem to have female voices by default. Weird, that. I don't know why they did it, but that's fun. We are now seeing the era of very functional robots with central processing units that are very similar to humans. So expect them in the future, if not now, to demand human rights. Or is it machine rights? Or is it robot rights? But we're already living in that era at the moment. And we're seeing now self-healing networks in our telecommunications networks. We're seeing self-healing robots as well, in terms of fixing a malfunction, electronic malfunction, knowing when their batteries are going to run out or their power source is going to run out and then charge themselves. So that's already now. And 7 is what I said earlier about machine learning. It's the same as AI. Right? It's an umbrella term. But what we're actually doing is teaching machines to think, which is the subject of Alan Turing's book in 1950. So this is just a slide to talk about artificial general intelligence. So I don't believe we're there now. Personally, I don't think we're going to get there in my lifetime. There's a lot of hysterics and thoughts about how do we impose guardrails on AI or how do we make it go faster. There are a lot of big tech companies now, including OpenAI, saying they're going to reach AGI this year. How will they know? I don't know. Maybe they'll make up a standard, a threshold, something to meet. But if you look at number one, we're continuing to invest in research and development across the world. Those two countries I mentioned earlier, probably the ones that are investing the most trillions of dollars in this area, as well as in other areas like quantum computing. And the other one that I personally interests me, as I said to you earlier, that I did medicine and then I went to electronic engineering. One of the most interesting sectors for me is synthetic biology for all sorts of medical therapeutic reasons. But we're also in the era of synthetic biology. Number two is a real tricky one about how artificial general intelligence development and deployment needs to be regulated. What is regulation? Is old historical way of regulation the correct way to develop policy for the future? Don't know. I suspect China is in the lead for their 1.7 billion citizens in this area about the deployment and regulating, simply because China has had experience for 30 years with Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, which I think are the world's top tech companies actually, in terms of what they do for society and their citizens. Understanding the impact of jobs on the economy. So you've always heard the phrase, I think, that AI is not going to replace humans, but AI is going to replace humans who do not use AI. Yeah. So we're probably 10 years from that space, and you'll see job innovation, job retraining. You're already seeing that in the world today, in terms of how machine learning, or in particular generative AI, can augment technology. I mean, I'm seeing Copilot from Microsoft used right the way across UK government at the moment. The challenge is most of the civil service there think that it's a new toy as opposed to an efficiency improvement. Then it's like a new toy. It's not a new toy. It is actually about driving efficiencies in public sector jobs in that example. So it's already having an impact on jobs and the economy. Transparency and accountability is a tricky one as well. How do policymakers ensure development, um, developers or governments are held accountable and transparency? So I mentioned I do some work in cybersecurity, so I'm very familiar with some of the things that, and actually Bletchley Park gave rise to GCHQ. That's the Government Central Headquarters Intelligence Service, one of the foremost listening depots. One of the best ventures who went across to the US in the 60s and created Langley for the CIA. That's a Central Intelligence Agency. So there are roots of a lot of this work that goes back to 40s and 50s. And so transparency and accountability in that world of potential, let's say, deepfake, deep video generation, um, rogue actors, rogue nations. There's a lot of tools that are out there. Um, and encouraging collaboration and dialogue. That's kind of how I see it, the positive side, which is how do we use generative AI to augment. I don't tend to use the word artificial intelligence. I tend to use the word augmented. Artificial sometimes kind of refers to maybe replacement. Augment is about adding. So that's typically how I remember it. And hence, one of my last slides actually, this one, which is remember human intelligence and go back to when you were a child, uh, when you grew up. Human intelligence about data sets, training, inference, and then sensory output, gestures, sound, um, eyes, ears, mouth. So that's your sensory output. Artificial intelligence is basically the same. It's a set of data sets, training, inference, and then sensory output. So artificial intelligence machines are being taught exactly the way we were when we were children. And then probably in our teenage years, we started to develop unconditional biases in our heads that formed our personalities. I'm also doing a lot of work at the moment in the UK with the Alzheimer's Society and early onset dementia using AI, which is to detect various things going on in the brain with EEGs and other behavioral things to detect. Dementia is a very big problem at the moment. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, um, and so that's an area that I spend a lot of my time on. It's on neurological deficit disorders. But and it's a big but, and this is where emotional intelligence. So it's not just about IQ, but about EQ, emotional intelligence. That's why I said earlier, I don't think we'll achieve AGI in my lifetime, because I think the aspect of humanity, which is around empathy, is, I believe, yet to be learned by machines. So thank you very much for listening to me. That was my short talk on a very big topic. Can I invite some questions from the audience, please? And I'll hand it to Abhinav.
Thank you, Pupi. And floor is open for questions. Those who have questions, please raise your hand. I'll pass the mic.
Why don't you think empathy cannot be stimulated? Like, speaking of how neuroscience and cognitive behaviors work, um, even hypnosis could be done over the phone call, and voices could connect well with the human brain. Me myself, I'm a fan of cognitive neuroscience, and also I'm an AI adapter. So I was just intrigued about your last slide. You said empathy is yet to arrive. Um, if someone is smart enough, they could stimulate empathy, right? What are your thoughts?
Well, you have to define empathy, right? And you have to define empathy in terms of its inputs and outputs. And so that's a subjective measure. It's not an objective measure. I'm working with some speech scientists at the moment in another business that worked at MIT on Stephen Hawking's voice box. So think about his life, how long he lived for, and how he was able to communicate with empathy. Okay, so, and that was artificial, right? There are other initiatives in the world. I don't know if you're aware of Neuralink.
Yes,
There's some research going on, and there's some interesting ways where uh, the electrical activity in the brain can be measured, synthesized, and allowed uh, communication with. So yeah, so there's plenty of research, and that's why I said on the AGI slide, there's trillions of dollars being spent on research and innovation. Did you have a follow-up?
Yep. I don't have a follow-up question. I mean, that's deep, what you said.
Yeah. It's a very quiet audience up and out for what I think is the hottest topic in the world right now, which is the inevitable path to AGI. How do we arrest it, or should we arrest it?
It's also kind of like goes along in the segment the scientific. It's now experience, right? It is some sort of personality to the system. So the personality around how people navigate, because right now if you ask a lecturer about the personality that they are getting from the student to let's say papers, they kind of seems to be now the assignments are all kind of same because they are integrated through AI system. Now the person that the individual can kind of AI on the personality of the individuals. How do you think?
I, I think you were alluding to uh, three or four there. And I think in the world of education, you're alluding to the use of LLMs for accessing information. Are you also saying what the role of university lecturers? Partly, I am. Yeah, so it's a big topic. I mean, ChatGPT and others have kind of unleashed a bigger genie, if you like, which is the accessibility for information to train and assessment, right? So in the example of assessment, sitting exams, are they the right way of assessing an intelligence of EQ? I mean, I probably shouldn't say that here, but in the UK, my niece and nephew have recently got degree apprenticeships. So they're sponsored by a company. They go to work in one is carpentry, the other is in law. They're attached to a firm and they do a degree on the side. So work becomes the main primary, the degree becomes secondary. I think that's the direction of travel. I think the conveyor belt of doing O levels, A levels, and university degrees like I did is probably in the past. And this is some of the society changes that are going on in the world, right? This is about um, the education system in this example producing relevant people for the world that they inhabit. Yeah. So that's a very, very important topic.
So you said you used to work with synthetic biology,
Synthetic.
synthetic biology. So where do you see the application of AI and LLMs in terms of technologies like CRISPR, genetic reprogramming?
So I think in medtech and healthcare, the ability to sequence proteins 24/7, in my opinion, will probably uh, output the cure for cancer.
Yeah.
Because research has to is finite limited by number of researchers, clinical professors, whoever in labs. The thing with AlphaFold, in that example from DeepMind at Google, is they can operate 24/7. They're already sequencing proteins faster than a team of humans would have for 5 years, right? So there is huge merit from a humanity perspective, as long as it's guardrails are put on it.
What do you think that AI has done for the main blockers? It's easy to synthesize a protein, but it takes 20 years to finish a clinical trial. Where do you think AI has been used significantly in terms of reducing the time taken for clinical trials?
Imaging. So in the UK's health service, imaging is now radiology department is done mainly by machine learning and AI because they can look at images using computer vision and be way more accurate than human pair of eyes. So that's an area that's seeing rapid advances and deployment in the US, UK, most of continental Europe at the moment as well. Is consultant radiologists having augmented intelligence on imaging, if that was the question.
Yes. Do you think that they would create stimulated environments to test these molecules or proteins, clinical trial with AI?
So that's a question of risk. So why do we do clinical trials? Because we live in different regulatory environments.
Exactly.
That's the only reason. So if you examine regulatory environment and you look at outcomes, maybe getting a tick box or a compliance is not as important as the outcome of saving humans. So it will turn the question of regulation on its head. It already is, actually. Rhonda, I'm looking at you next. I will.
Hi, Kumi, sir. I quote yourself, I think AI will not take jobs, it will take jobs of people who are not using AI, right? So, with your exposure and things are going in 10 years of time, how you see what kind of jobs will be totally gone and there is a blur area. What is a job?
If I had the answer to that, I'd be doing the lottery every day, wouldn't I? I think we're seeing a lot of job reinvention. So I don't think I can possibly predict what's going to happen in 10 years, but we're going to see a changing workforce. We talked about medicine, right? We also have private healthcare systems and public healthcare systems. AI is being deployed in private healthcare systems way in advance of, say, the UK's national health service, right? China, India, US is adopting technology way quicker than the UK, way quicker. And so that's another societal issue that we're having. There'll be a number of transportation, logistics, housing, how we deal with continued carbon emissions by China and India. There's a big lobby in the UK, and I think we contribute to that 2 or 3% of the worldwide carbon emissions. So I always say, if you want to lobby, spend some time with the Chinese and Indian governments. Although if you want to affect the outcomes, do something useful, right? So those are the areas where I think measurement of, for example, carbon emissions, creating new sustainable projects, uh, green cities that I've seen in Saudi and Abu Dhabi, for example. Abu Dhabi has got some incredible infrastructure deployment using AI. So those are some of the sectors that are probably going to get impacted and are being impacted.
Maybe about new role, let's say one company might have majority of robots and AI and few humans. So in that case, any human-centric new roles will come in where like we are working with the entire set of humans and someone in 10 years down the line working with robots with 1 or 2 humans. So is there any human-centric roles will come up as you see like psychological?
Well, maybe human or robots in those areas in smart warehousing may have some psychological disorders. We don't know, right? So certainly management of that workforce is important, right? So Amazon's e-commerce business, their manufacturing and logistics is mainly machine led. If you visit ever Amazon's logistics factory, you'll see it's predominantly robotic. There's no human pluckers and putting it in the factory, right? Predominantly, that's why, uh, they're a logistics powerhouse. Logistics powerhouse.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thanks, Nina. Touching on to what you mentioned about the regulatory environment, how that's turning on its head. How do you see it's already blurring the lines between what we call privacy and what we control as information as a whole? And again, touching on what you said in your presentation of who owns data and where is it going to rest. So how do you think privacy is going to evolve with the pace of speed that we see?
How does, sorry,
Privacy, the notion of privacy.
yeah. So privacy has always been related to our own definition of what's valuable to us. As I mentioned before, in 2015, 2016, I ran an identity business in Sri Lanka, and that was our SIM identity using for passwordless authentication. So we have other aspects of our identity, our personality, who do we live with, what's our community. So they're all aspects of privacy, but it goes back to the issue of trust. It goes back to the issue of trust and in terms of who do you trust with your personal data? Do you trust the government? Or do you trust the government's allies? So there are lots of questions being raised at the moment as we become an increased connected society and as we outsource our personal data more and more. Large language models arose from the fact that we were communicating with machines that allowed these massive language models to exist, and it's coming out with generative AI solutions. So we all used freemium products over the last 10 years on voice. That's the output. Because in a freemium product, you're probably the product. And so I take the view that we kind of sleepwalk. Or in identity, I often talk about the concept of uninformed consent. So we tend to consent to the use of technology a lot. I would say 90% is uninformed. Who's going to read 5-page terms and conditions? No one. People just click the box. That's uninformed consent. So regulation may have a part to play. Um, I generally think that Western governments are about 20 years behind where technology is. So if their citizens have discovered the technology, governments tend to fall behind on regulation unless you keep ahead of the technology. I don't know whether I've answered your question or not, but I think a lot of it is society governance and the type of governance that we deserve or want or achieve. A lot of the conflicts in the world today are probably down to um, societal governance and what those governments involved in those conflicts think is right or wrong. So the notion of privacy and trust, I think, again, is coming back to who thinks what is right, who thinks what is wrong. It's a very philosophical, deep question on an AI talk.
More question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of energy requirement, like AI is like most of the AI models are talking like gigawatt scale data. So these data centers mainly operate on base load. They will run for days and days and months. Uh, Most of us think sometimes we could use solar power and use this what do you think of an impact in terms of energy requirement these AI tools, AI clusters gonna impact in terms of growth? Because this can suck the energy very quickly.
So water is the biggest resource, I think, in the whole data center world right now because the heat dissipation is massive. Because as you create larger and larger language model, and I talked about an arms race, this arms race is being perpetuated by those kind of companies together with NVIDIA. I call it the new Wintel of our generation. If you remember how Windows and Intel pretty much work, Microsoft and Intel pretty much work in tandem for the next release, the next hardware, the next release, the next thing. That went on for decades. They used Taiwanese ODMs to churn out the machines. That industry is more or less finished. People were talking to me earlier about different human-centric. But you've already seen the changes in Intel. Intel gave the name Silicon Valley. I always said, when people say they want to be the next Silicon Valley, I generally say, why don't you try to be the next, whatever the next best thing is, right? Because Intel is going through a terrible time. It's just had a government rescue. The US government now owns 10% of Intel, while NVIDIA is a $4 trillion company. So data centers consume water, electricity, so I think, like with XAI, I think the leaders of this gold rush need to look at efficient GPU workload, efficient use of data centers, maybe look at an architecture that's more similar to edge compute versus everything being client server. So these are some of the things I think are being thought through. But in this arms race, it's a given that Google, Meta, um, Microsoft are establishing ever bigger data centers with ever more energy needs. It's just a fact of life because we're all using these technologies. If we en masse as a planet stop using these things, you'll see data center infrastructure change. But we as a planet are using these things. So data centers are a fact of life. We just hope that some of these companies are able to look at efficiency in the design and deployment of data centers. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah. So do you think like data centers have the data centers that scale, any scale right now?
I do. So this topic came up in Abu Dhabi in April, where we were talking about generative AI and data center being closer to the consuming side. So this was just after Prime Minister Modi's state visit in Sri Lanka, where they actually talked about connecting some of uh, the infrastructure needs between India and Sri Lanka. So I think Sri Lanka can, and I talked about with one of the data center chairmen in India, actually in Abu Dhabi, which is the need for, say, different types of innovation for countries like Sri Lanka. And one could be absolutely data centers that are serving content to the people of Sri Lanka.
Yes. Thank you.
Abhinav, did you have a couple of questions you said, or we're good? No, yours. Oh, okay.
Question. So countries like ours are like having the digital divide for a while, and now few companies are running it, few countries are running it, and yes, the AI and all of that they bring the knowledge much closer to our head, but they also like create the digital gap kind of wide, and those who have a bit of understanding can now accelerate. Those who don't know now they don't come back. So what can communities like these small communities like can be yeah, like we can be certain other small communities can do to reduce these gap countries like ours, the communities like ours.
I think it's a great question, and it's a follow-up from the other question on data centers. Um, I generally comment that we need to be careful from perceived labels. So when you talk about digital divide, I can probably say that Sri Lanka was the leader in registering a sin against every single human, so that you have very close collaboration in terms of who uses SIM for track and trace. So all sorts of things. US, UK, most of Europe don't even have that for the reasons of privacy. For the reasons of privacy. So that was pioneered by Dialog 25 years ago. On the back of that, all sorts of services in terms of SMS, a number of digital services uh, happened way before in Europe. So I would be careful about perceived labels, uh, how should I put it, from new governments creating departments, if I can put it like that. So let's look at the actual data and the detail. So I think there's a lot of innovation in Sri Lanka. The biggest thing I see is brain drain. And so one of the reasons personally I took that role on in 2015 is to create a startup in Colombo, even though my family were living in London, is to prevent brain drain. And I think that's, as leaders, we need to kind of all share in preventing brain drain. In the United Kingdom, we're seeing probably the biggest brain drain out of the United Kingdom in my lifetime. A millionaire leaves every 45 minutes in the United Kingdom right now. We're seeing mass exodus of wealth creators because of government policy and decisions. So that's kind of look at the bigger picture, right? And see, well, what's going on really in societies to cause these impacts. So therefore, I do think that Sri Lanka has the opportunity then to retain talent, create innovation, participate in, say, upcoming technologies, not the 1940s label, but the new generation of technologies, and drive the economy through those items.
It's like security. Um,
Well,
how do you use it?
so when we connect things or people, we're increasing the attack surface, essentially the points of attack. So equally, machine learning can be used to detect that. So one of the things we're doing in another business on voice is you're probably aware of fingerprinting and how you can spoof fingerprints using gelatine. Yeah, that's quite easy to lift it and then copy it to unlock a door, a building, a phone. So those kind of areas we're trying to prevent using voice. So what we're doing is voice printing your vocal tract. So your vocal tract is unique at birth. Even a synthesized voice doesn't give the same array as your own human voice. So we can use machines to detect deepfake audio or someone pretending to be you to unlock uh, various assets. So that's an area I won't go into too much depth because that business is spending a lot of time at the moment with military and defense governments around the world.
How different it is from someone recording to one?
But they're recording you from a physical speaker that's outputting voice using vibration. It's not the same as your source and filter. Vocal tract, nasal cavity, that creates uniqueness. Yeah. And that business is doing it with a deep neural network, using a DNA at 400 kilobytes on a tiny piece of silicon. So it can be used on many, many edge devices.
Just curious how it's trained. Just curious how it's trained.
How do you train it offline? You train it offline with the biggest data sets as you can. And then you deploy the neural network on device on chip. Interesting. Which is completely the reverse of what Amazon, Google, Microsoft. I mean, some of you may have iPhones. I don't, but some of you may have iPhones, and you may think that Siri is actually on your device. That's Apple marketing. It's actually processed in the cloud. Try doing Siri disconnect, go into airplane mode, and see if you can do things. And you'll find you are.
All right.
questions? Yes, one questions. Just a quick one. Could you please reiterate like how important is human in terms of AGI? How important is to have a human in the room with AGI when it comes to decision making? And
Yeah, so artificial general intelligence, by definition, doesn't include humans. Definition, because we've achieved the point of singularity that Stephen Hawking produced in this. And so I think we have to put appropriate guardrails on the development of machine learning algorithms by machine learning scientists and engineers now in these big companies in order that if and when we reach AGI, which my lifetime, I don't think it will, we will. As we approach that event horizon, then I think that the, the powers of certain societies, I talked about two countries in the world earlier, it is important to regulate in terms of how they develop and deploy machine learning algorithms.
the other questions?
It's perspective of open source models. They are currently now releasing the weights and all. So my question like closed labs are spending more resources than testing on these safety measures and all. So what kind of activities or steps that open source models of agents can community can perform to uplift that skill? That's
Are you familiar with the open source licensing models and the GPL and things like that? Different copyleft, copyright, source code.
not much.
So you're familiar with Android. You're familiar with iOS. So Android 2007 was released by Google under an Android open source project, AOSP. But it was a weak copyleft. And so the roadmap was controlled by Google of all features, yet the community contributed towards its development under open source. So what I'm trying to say is there's open source and open source. So I have to look quite closely at some of the licensing. And when it's open source, usually I find that people are trying to get technology out into the marketplace. Llama is a good example of that. It's very capable, but there's probably a reason why Meta have chosen an open source LLM and OpenAI are moving towards more and more closed LLMs because they have a charging model for GPT. So business models usually will dictate what licensing regime you put a bit of software out. But generally, I find open source is a good way of getting technology in the field without the barrier of licensing, the barrier of price, those kind of things, is to get vendors to get technology out in the field for testing, market validation. Yeah, I think
How likely do you think? How likely do you think we come to a situation where US and China are US, we get to a similar situation where large scale national level social do you think that's something that
already have. So, I talked about Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent a while ago. So that's a good example why the roadmap of those products was driven by the CCP in Beijing over 20 plus years. And actually, they're the only country that's been very successful in maintaining data sovereignty across its borders. I've traveled a lot in China, and I would never be able to use Microsoft or Google products. I can't use Google Search, nothing on my smartphone, right? Because they're not blocked. So they did that deliberately with a 20-year vision, because that was a regime that understood the power of such technologies 20 years ago. I talked about the 20 years earlier. So other forms of in the West, uh, India doesn't allow TikTok. UK does. US does. Uh, it's probably one of the biggest social platforms for delivering social engineering, social conditioning now, as was Instagram and Snapchat maybe 20 years ago. You're all being profiled. The question is, do you know it? So,
South Korea, Google Maps
hmm?
is enabled to access Australia and stuff like that. Do you think similarly, TikTok is banned? Do you think we'll get to the point where nations large scale stop banning social media to avoid social engineering? But you mentioned it already taking place. What do governments do?
Well, I think governments need to increase technology competence. So if you go and look at the federal government of the US over the last 20 years, or the CCP, they hire engineers and scientists and policymakers. So I always tell the UK government, please have a look at the government and what is their background and capabilities. Right? So I think you have to increase competence. You have to reduce the size of the public sector, but increase the competence. And that's about understanding some of these technologies better, and therefore driving policy for your citizens that elect you, right? In countries that elections happen, to be able to think about what's possible, what's in the hands of our, I mentioned Alzheimer's Society earlier. I focus on Generation Beta there. Generation Beta haven't been born yet. We're living in the world of millennials, Gen Z who are giving birth to Generation Alpha. I tend to focus on the environment for Generation Beta, because largely social conditioning for Gen Z and Alpha, therefore, is already done. Already done. So you have to kind of look way forward to be able to change some of the parameters and things like that. And that's why I think dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, we're going to see a lot more of that in the world in the coming years. A lot more.
Any more questions?
I'll be around for the next few hours, dotting around here anyway. So got my contact details, by all means, reach out to me. Um, I joined, showing my age, I joined LinkedIn in 2003 when we had like 50,000. It's about 400 million active users. So that's a good form of social conditioning. How everyone tends to use LinkedIn for business connection. So that was 2003. Microsoft acquired it for some absurd sum. It's now a business conditioning. It uses algorithms. It uses your behavior. It feeds you. It's got other products. It's completely different LinkedIn to when I joined 20 plus years ago. So you can reach me on that. You can connect with me there. Feel free to do so. No problem. Thanks, Amna. Thank you all.
So in the absence of questions, I think we will wrap up this session. As we said, we will be around for a couple of hours. If you want to come and meet and talk, please feel free to do that. It will be around the space or in the lobby area at the front.
And the pitching tomorrow?
Yeah, so he will also be here for the pitch competition tomorrow, but I don't think they will be full of you because we have.
Oh, you've got us working really hard. Abhinav sent me an email late last night saying, please show up at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. I don't think you've heard of jet lag, right?
Yeah, so thank you everyone. Thank you for joining this Masster Glass. I hope you got valuable information in a very hot topic, which is AGI, which is like booming. And if you have more questions, please even feel free to write to us so we will put the connection with Kumi as well. Thank you so much, Kumi, for coming and delivering this session, volunteering your time. It means a lot. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay.